All right, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to the February 2020 meeting of the Denver Astrology Group. If this is your first time attending the group, we always hold our meetings on the second Saturday of each month, always right here at the Mercury Cafe from 3 to 5 p.m. There's very rarely, I don't think we've missed a meeting in over 10 years, so you can pretty much always know that you'll find us here on the second Saturday. Sometimes we schedule our meetings kind of late because we like to keep things flexible because sometimes we'll be able to catch a speaker who's coming through from out of town. Other times we schedule ahead a few weeks. This time was kind of a short notice meeting, but you can always find out about what the next meeting topic will be as soon as we announce it, as long as you sign up for our group on meetup.com. Any other news and announcements?
We do have 2020 astrology posters back there in a bundle for $20. If you haven't gotten yours already, it says all of the different astrological alignments coming up for the year and so forth.
Yeah, so at this meeting today, we're going to be talking about astrology and relationships, and specifically placements in a birth chart that indicate different factors that will come up in relationships in a person's life. So we're going to focus especially on planets in the seventh house, the condition and placement of the ruler of the seventh house, and then also the condition and placement of Venus in the birth chart as general indicators for relationships. And as we go through, we're going to go through different, touch on very briefly a few other factors like synastry, transits, and other timing techniques as we can get to them. Mm-hmm. So this is, if all goes well, this may end up being released as the recording of this. I'm going to record the video and the audio, and it may be released as episode 243 or 244 of the Astrology Podcast on YouTube and on the astrologypodcast.com. So we're going to Leisa and I are going to be talking about and sharing some charts from our private files for relationship placements, but we're also hoping that people in the audience would feel comfortable sharing some of their stories if they have a good retrospective placement that they want to share about how relationships have worked out in their life. So because we only have 2 hours, we'll have to keep those stories somewhat concise. But nonetheless, hopefully once we get into it and you get the hang of what we're looking for in charts, if you have a placement like that in your chart that matches a specific story that you'd like to share with the group, then please feel free to come up and use this microphone in order to share it. Mm-hmm. Any other preliminary announcements about the topic?
No, I don't think so. I think we're going to go through some chart examples first and the concepts, and then we'll go through some sharing after that. And just be sure that you are willing to have your story on the podcast potentially if you do share your story.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So here's the chart for the moment. Ironically, Venus is like right on the midheaven at the highest point, at its highest elevation right now in the middle of the sky. So that seems fitting. And our venue just finished decorating for Valentine's Day here at the Mercury Cafe. So that's part of the reason why we wanted to do this meeting. It's been a few years since we did another relationship talk. I think back in like 2010, we did a Valentine's Day talk on Venus. Mm-hmm. So since it's been 10 years, we thought it would be a good time to reprise that topic. Mm-hmm. All right. So let's talk about relationships in the birth chart and how they show up and how you can find out information about how a person's relationships and specifically their romantic or their love life will go based on their birth chart. Since that's one of the biggest questions I feel like people often come to astrology with is not just questions about career, which is another big one, but also questions about relationships, and navigating relationships is just a major topic that astrologers have always dealt with historically for the past 2,000 or 3,000 years.
Definitely. Yeah, it's definitely a common topic that people bring up for questions.
Yeah. Did I introduce you or myself?
No, we didn't do introductions.
So joining me co-hosting this meeting is Leisa Schaim, co-organizer of the Denver Astrology Group.
Hello.
And I'm Chris Brennan, and I'm the host of the Astrology Podcast, as well as founder of the Denver Astrology Group. We're going to be me and Leisa have a background that is a mixture of both ancient astrology and modern astrology, and we try to synthesize those ancient and modern traditions to take the best of both worlds and sort of bring them together. And that's part of what we want to demonstrate here today is how we've created a synthesis that's been useful for looking at relationships in client charts, but also in celebrity chart examples as well. Mm-hmm. And this is something that you're always applying because you're still doing consultations, like at least 2 a day?
Yeah. So I'm doing consultations full time.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so let's jump right into it. There's three main factors that we're going to look at and focus on when it comes to relationships, um, and indicators for that. The first one, and the one that everybody focuses on initially, and probably the most prominent and easy one to call, is when a person has placements in the seventh house in their birth chart. Since historically or traditionally, the primary place that one looks for relationships in the birth chart is the right side of the chart, which coincides with the western horizon, where the planets set and sink out of sight each day. And there's a sort of merging of the sky and the earth. So the ascendant, which is the eastern horizon on the left side of the chart, and the first house represents the native, your sense of self, and the person who is born at that specific moment in time. And the first house is the house that's most closely connected with you in the birth chart, whereas the rest of the 12 houses tend to signify or tend to indicate other people in your life and not necessarily you directly, but instead those that are around you.
Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at the seventh house tends to typify the type of people that you attract for relationships, the types of qualities that you tend to experience in relationships, and those sorts of things. And as we go, there's other things you can sometimes see with the seventh house as well.
Yeah. So if the first house is the sense of self, the seventh house is the opposite of that, and it's the sense of other. So there's different ways to look at that depending on if you're coming from the modern or an ancient approach. So in the ancient approach, it tends to be more objectively describing the type of people that you will tend to run into or potentially even have long-term relationships with in your life. And in some instances, it may only be, you may have a specific placement in the seventh house that just speaks primarily to one important relationship that you'll have at some point in your life, for better or worse. And in some instances, that might be a positive placement that indicates some really positive relationship or event in relationships that might occur at some point in your life. And in other instances, it might be a more challenging placement that indicates something difficult that comes up in the sphere of relationships or when it comes to relating to other people in your life. And that's generally the more ancient approach. The modern approach tends to see the seventh house more as parts of a person's psyche that are somehow hidden or submerged, and sometimes where that which you don't identify in yourself is imported into your life through other people. So that sometimes it shows the types of people that you might tend to attract as recurring themes throughout your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that early part is important in terms of not just concretely the type of people you attract, but that it's not. Sometimes it can be focused more. A placement in the seventh house can be focused more on a particular relationship you have sometimes, and not necessarily like all the relationships throughout your entire life. Sometimes it'll be more focal.
Right. So we want to, as we're going through some of our stories, keep an open mind to that there's different scenarios. There's one scenario where there's a specific placement that just indicates this one relationship that happens at some point in a person's life that's defining. Like, think of somebody who is well known, like a celebrity who had a particularly important relationship once in their life that ended up defining what they became known for, or ended up being the defining relationship of their life. Versus think of somebody else or even somebody you know who has had specific types of relationships that represent recurring themes where they keep having the same relationship over and over again. And it's not like a one-time thing, but instead it's like a variation of the same song or the same experience.
Mm-hmm. And I think proportionally of those two approaches you were talking about earlier, the modern and traditional takes on the seventh house, I tend to lean more heavily on the traditional in terms of it representing the concrete partners that you have. I don't discount the other piece, that sometimes it can be about how you approach relationships or something about yourself that gets drawn out in relationships. But for the most part, I lean more on the first part. I don't know if that's where you lean.
Yeah, I think it varies just depending on the person and depending on what
Mm-hmm.
placements. Like, for example, if somebody has the ruler of the ascendant, which represents the person's sense of self, but also their life direction and what they tend to focus on. If they have the ruler of the ascendant in the seventh house, then sometimes their sense of self is defined in terms of their relationships and the people that they get into relationships with.
Mhm.
So sometimes that can be more of like a recurring thing.
Yeah.
Versus other instances where it's just a planet that's in the seventh, that's not the ruler of the ascendant. It can sometimes just be like a one-off type event.
Right.
Why don't we put some charts up in order to start like getting some concrete examples?
Okay.
All right. So we threw together some different chart examples, and let's start with some of just like seventh house placements, or um, let's start with just some positive ones, because we're going to alternate between like some extremely positive ones and some extremely negative ones in order to give you guys the full spectrum. And that's one of the things maybe we should state right from the start in terms of um, like a warning that we're doing more of like a work session amongst astrologers. And while there's obviously a lot of people will be interested and focused on this more from the perspective of maybe like their own life or applying it directly to their own birth chart, we're speaking more as practitioners here and trying to understand all of the various manifestations that can take place when you're applying astrology as like a technical discipline. And sometimes that means being able to look at and objectively understand the extreme ends of the spectrum of human experience, of both sometimes extremely positive things that happen to some people who are particularly fortunate when it comes to relationships, versus other times there can be instances of extreme misfortune or challenge or even tragedy in the context of relationships. And being able to identify that as astrologers and what signified that in the birth chart is important to us as a practice and in order to become better as practitioners.
Yeah, definitely. And also, sort of as a tag on to that, if there are placements in these charts that are similar to your own, don't worry too much if it is like a negative example, because while we're going over some of the main interpretive principles about these placements, it's certainly not going to be going over all of them. And so there will most likely still be differences between your chart and theirs.
Yeah. And we're going to be picking out individual placements and focusing in on them and not giving the entire delineation. And that's one of the things that you won't be able to do, is take any one of these examples and apply it directly into your chart, because it would be taken out of the context of your chart as a whole. And every placement needs to be interpreted in that complete context.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's start. This is one of my favorite examples. This is actually a client chart, and they gave me a release to use this as a chart example, but it was actually a couple that came in for a consultation at one point. And one of the things that I loved is they both had the same placements. They had different charts, and I think they were born like a year or two apart, but they both had the most positive planet in their birth chart in the seventh house of relationships, and they were both in their like 70s or 80s at this point, and they had been married for over 60 years. So they had a long and successful and healthy marriage. And part of the context is that, so interpretive rule number one, if you have a day chart, then the most positive planet in your chart, other factors aside, is Jupiter. Whereas if you were born at night with the sun anywhere in the bottom half of the chart below the horizon when it was still dark out, then the most positive planet in your chart was Venus. So in this chart, this person was born with a night chart. The sun is in the bottom half of the chart in the sixth house. So the most positive planet is Venus, and Venus is located in Cancer, and he was born with Capricorn rising. So using whole sign houses, where you just find what sign the ascendant is located in, and then that sign becomes the first house, the sign after that becomes the second house, and so on and so forth. Venus, because it's placed in Cancer, which is the seventh sign from the rising sign, is in the seventh house of relationships. So sometimes the delineations can be very simple like that, which is just simply if the most positive planet in the chart, based on that concept of day and night, which is known as the concept of sect, if the most positive planet is in the seventh house, then it may be good indication, other factors aside, that some of the most positive events that will happen in that person's life, especially subjectively positive, will happen in the sphere of relationships. For him, it was that he met the love of his life relatively early when he was like 18 or 19 years old, and they spent the rest of their lives together.
Mm-hmm. And all other factors being equal, that is the context in which you often see very long marriages or long-term relationships that are happy, is the Venus in a night chart in the inner ruling the seventh, or Jupiter in a day chart inner ruling the seventh.
So here's his partner's chart. And she was also interestingly born with Capricorn rising. They both have roughly the same ascendant, basically, within a few degrees, late Capricorn. And her sun is in the seventh house, but because her ascendant degree is at 25 Capricorn, that means the descendant, which represents the horizon, is at 25 Cancer. So she was born about an hour or so after sunset. So this is firmly a night chart. And again, she has Venus at 22 Cancer in the seventh whole sign house. So similar placement, she has a night chart with the most positive planet in the chart in the seventh house of relationships. So we're already seeing some interesting things here where we found a couple of two people that were born in different places, but they ended up meeting up when they were like 18, 19, or 20 years old. They both had the same rising sign and they both had the same Venus placement in a night chart in the seventh house. They found each other and then they spent the rest of their lives together in a relatively happy and successful marriage.
That's lovely. It's nice to start on such a good example. That's definitely the positive extreme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're gonna vary, so let's not get too comfortable. But this is the positive example. This is always one of my most favorite example charts for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. So, other placements of planets in the seventh house, sometimes something that can indicate that relationships is important. I already mentioned the ruler of the ascendant being in the seventh house because in ancient astrology, the first house was called the helm, which is sort of like the helm of a ship, like a boat, or like the steering wheel of a ship. So the first house was called the helm, and the ruler of the ascendant, the planet that rules the zodiacal sign that is rising at the moment of birth, was referred to as the captain of the ship or the steersman of the ship. So whatever house it's placed in, it can sometimes send the native on a course towards those topics in the life and make those topics more prominent or more important in the person's life than they might be for somebody else or for anybody else that doesn't have that placement. So that's one thing that can show relationships are going to be more important in your life if you have the ruler of the ascendant in the seventh house. So an example of that is Carl Sagan, who has Taurus rising, and the ruler of the ascendant is Venus, because Venus rules Taurus, and Venus is placed in Scorpio in the seventh whole sign house of relationships. So his chart, though, is unique because he has one of the other indicators that can sometimes indicate that relationships are very important in the life, which is that he has a stellium of more than 3 planets in the seventh house. So it's not just the ruler of his ascendant, which is Venus, but also Jupiter, Mercury, and the Sun are also placed in his seventh house of relationships, thus indicating that relationships would be a major focus in his life. So he ended up having, he was married 3 different times, and the third time ended up being important because it was somebody that he ended up working with very closely on projects later in his life, and they collaborated on things like the Cosmos series, which became very important or very prominent in the 1980s, where like over 1 billion people watched it or something like that. And then after he died prematurely of illness, his wife ended up carrying on some of his other projects from that point forward and continued to be a consultant for some of those subsequent things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say when there's a stellium in the seventh house, people are usually aware that partnership is important to them. I think sometimes when the ascendant ruler is in the seventh, some people are very conscious of that and some people aren't, because sometimes they already know, yes, partnership is an important topic to me, but just having the ascendant ruler directing your life towards that can also just mean that your life is being directed towards partnership, at least at some point in your life, in a way that will kind of not overshadow, that's not the right word, but in a way that will be very central to your life, at least during some portion of your life. And you may not actually be trying for that, but it still ends up that way.
Right. Yeah, and depending on the planet also, there can be different ways that the person behaves in relationships or how successful they are or what they actually bring to the relationship that can be characterized by the planet as well.
Right.
So yeah, we don't have to go too far into that, but depending on the planet, like Venus, for example, in his chart could be, in a night chart, could be more of a positive influence that he's bringing to relationships and bringing to his partnerships. There might be other scenarios where, what if you're bringing something challenging or bringing sort of baggage to the relationship in other scenarios is a different sort of placement that sometimes comes up.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And some of the placements, I don't know if we're going to get into some of these examples. Some of the placements you can look at in the seventh house can refer to either the illustration of the general significator of that planet, like what does Jupiter mean in the seventh, all other factors being equal, even without house rulerships. And we can also bring in what houses they rule as well.
Yeah, and we'll get to house rulership
Mm-hmm.
in just a minute. All right, so that's an example of the ruler of the ascendant as well as a stellium. Should we switch to like challenging examples?
Sure.
Okay, like Biden. So Biden's a good example because this is Joe Biden's chart, who's a former vice president. He's also currently running for the presidency in the Democratic race primaries right now. He has a rounded time, but it's an 8:30 a.m. time, which gives him early Sagittarius rising. And he has Saturn in the seventh house conjunct Uranus right around the descendant in a day chart. So what ended up happening is when he turned 30, he was going through his Saturn return, and he was elected to public office for the first time and basically began his career as a politician. But about a month after he was elected, his wife and family was like running errands or something for Christmas, and they're involved in a car accident, and his wife and I believe like daughter died.
Yeah, at least one child.
Yeah, but he lost his first wife basically in a car accident around the time of his Saturn return, and he has Saturn in the seventh house as well as Uranus as well. So this is kind of a challenging placement, and it brings up another factor of interpretation when it comes to relationship astrology, which is that sometimes when you have planets in the seventh house, when you have a transit that goes through the seventh house, it can indicate a major event that happens within the context of relationships. In this case, since it was an outer planet transit, it was a major event. Other times, if you just have a fast-moving transit of an inner planet like Mercury or Venus, it can sometimes just be a very quick, low-level event, but still notable within the context of relationships. But just the general idea that transits through the seventh indicate events and circumstances in your life with respect to relationships at different points.
Right. Yeah, so with Uranus here in the seventh, it could indicate sudden events with regard to relationships or with regard to your partner. And then Saturn, it's a day chart, so it's usually a more constructive Saturn, although Saturn even in itself, regardless of the sect, can be about things that are challenging or heavy experiences, or at the very least, like heavy responsibilities or something like that. And so I don't think the Saturn-Uranus alone, although it does describe some of this, would have ended up in a car crash. I think to do that, we have to go to the ruler of the seventh house. Yeah.
What's the ruler?
So the ruler is going to be Mercury, since Gemini is the seventh house. Mercury is placed in the 12th house, and it's kind of loosely conjunct Mars, and Mars is the more challenging planet in a day chart. So that in itself would already kind of bring more of the challenges than this, adding on to the Saturn in the seventh. But the fact that it's also in the 12th can sometimes be loss. And certainly if you have the more challenging planet between Mars and Saturn in the 12th, that can go that way with more confirmation.
Yeah. Other times, I think you've had client chart examples that you mentioned of somebody that had the ruler of the 7th and the 12th, and they just met their partner within the context of like a 12th house circumstance, right?
Yes. Yeah. So, and I don't know if we'll have time to go into any of the rulers of the 7th in the houses, but sometimes it can be about where you meet people. It's not always just like, sometimes it can describe the person themselves, and sometimes it can be just about where you meet them, and not all the time. I have one where they met someone while bottoming out from addiction and literally dying in a rehab center, and the person they met was a nurse. And that's now their partner. So that's a 12th house kind of extreme ruler of the 7th and the 12th getting triggered.
Right. I mean, what are other 12th house that are like more neutral? Like 12th house can tend to be like places of isolation, like hospitals, like ashrams.
Yeah. I mean, I've known or had clients with a bunch of people who have the ruler of the 7th and the 12th, and their partners are just very reclusive for one reason or another. Sometimes just personality-wise reclusive. Sometimes because their partner has a health issue, and so they have to stay home more. But either way, reclusive is often a word I use for the ruler of the 7th and the 12th.
Yeah. I'm looking through to see if I have any other 7th house ones lined up, but I think in terms of just placements where we don't get into the ruler, that might be it. So we might go to... Oh yeah, there was actually one other positive one. So Richard Nixon, like, regardless of what one thinks about his politics or what his place was in history in terms of stepping down from the presidency, one part of his life that actually went relatively well was his relationships. And again, looking at his chart, he has a night chart with the sun in the 5th house, so it's below the horizon. He was born at 9:35 at night. And so the most positive planet in his chart is Venus. And Venus is actually in Pisces, where it's exalted in the 7th house in a night chart, which is the place of relationships. And he ended up having a long, multi-decade long marriage that ended up being relatively successful. So again, just sometimes placements in the 7th house can describe how a person's relationships go, for better or worse, and whether some of the most characteristic things in the person's life are going to be positive occurrences, or if there's going to be some challenging occurrences that become somehow characteristic traits of the person's life. If you were to try to write a biography about that person's entire life and put it all in a single book or a single, even like paragraph, what things would stand out and what would you mention? All right. So, first things first, this might be a good point to see if we have any examples. Does anybody have a good example, especially in terms of an extreme like that, of a placement in your 7th house, especially your 7th whole sign house, that's really characterized something major, something notable in terms of your relationships at this point in your life? Anyone that you feel like sharing? Do you feel like sharing it? Okay. Yeah, that's okay. Okay, do you want to come up to the mic? And do you mind if I put your chart up really quick?
No, that's fine. July 27th. Ancestral. EL.
EL. July 27th?
75.
1975. What time?
9:41 a.m.
Okay.
Fort Collins, Colorado.
All right. And is your ascendant 17 Virgo?
Yes.
Okay. So your rising sign is 17 Virgo, and you have Pisces on the 7th house, and the moon is in the 7th house in a day chart. Okay.
So really simply, well, I'm married now, but my first love partner, I might tear up. I've actually been talking about this a lot lately. Died when Uranus hit my moon.
Okay. So when Uranus is going through Pisces and it conjoined your moon exactly at 23 Pisces, you lost your first marriage partner?
No, my first love. Okay. I wasn't with him when it happened, but he was raised here, my good friend. It was one of the most pivotal, formative relationships of my life. So, yeah, it's just kind of colored everything for me. Sure. And it's been a lot to reconcile, even to the point where I recently did an interview on grief about it. Just how do you reconcile losing somebody when you're not with them, but yet they're truly the most formative person to being in relationships, and all of that's really having that relationship with this person that was so positive has infused every other relationship in my life.
Sure. Do you mind if I ask how it happened or what happened?
Yeah, he was tragically killed in China in 2009 with 3 other men.
Okay.
In a climbing accident.
Okay, so it's just a freak, unexpected thing?
Yeah, it was unexpected, but there's some speculation that they were just going to retrieve their equipment. They were actually trying to get off the mountain, and in the process, they were killed by a major avalanche. And only 2 of the 3 men were found. Well, that's really vulnerable to share with all of you guys. But I think the other thing that's really interesting about it is it's played into me becoming a psychotherapist and also given me a lot of leverage in the work that I do. Like, it's just really helped me understand what grief really looks like and be able to be a really great ally for people in that process.
Sure.
So it's colored my life in multiple ways. Yeah.
Probably made you more empathetic to people in similar circumstances.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Uranus was like right around, late Pisces in 2009.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually like went to the time frame because they're not exactly sure of the exact day they died. It was either anywhere between May 25th to June 6th, 2009, because it took us several weeks to know that their bodies were missing or their people were missing. And Ray and I were actually together when that happened. So it's kind of cool that she's here today.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. So on the one hand, the Uranus transit was going through your 7th house, and it was actually going back and forth and getting ready to go into your 8th house because Uranus was getting ready to go into Aries.
Yeah.
But also this is one of the instances where paying attention to the condition of the ruler of this 7th is important.
Yeah. So, I mean, the moon in the 7th definitely speaks to all of the motion that you've had around this. And, you saying that has lent itself to becoming a better therapist, which is very moon in the 7th, like emotionally relating to other people one-on-one. And client work is often 7th house in addition to partnership. The ruler of your 7th is that Jupiter in the 8th house. And, it's not the case for everyone that has the ruler of the 7th and the 8th that their partner will, die well before them. But mortality is one of among several 8th house topics. So it is something that does come up for some people.
Sure. And Uranus itself and Jupiter. So Jupiter's in the 8th house, which one of the significations of the 8th can be related to mortality. And it's opposite to Uranus natally, which can sometimes be something unexpected. And then it's also closely squaring Saturn at 24. Cancer is squaring Jupiter.
Right.
So the ruler, but then at the same time, it's a day chart. So Jupiter is also the most positive planet in the chart. So it's also indicating or promising something positive in terms of coming out of that placement at the same time instead of just being purely negative.
Right. And that's actually kind of interesting as well with regard to what you were saying about you growing as a therapist through that, because 8th house placements can sometimes, for some people, be about like helping others through crisis. So, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. And if anybody wants to watch it, I did a 30-minute interview on that experience. And then Jupiter has become like that placement. So my current husband, it's brought a lot of abundance and, of course, a lot going on with money. And we're currently building a house together. So it's just interesting to see both sides of it, really.
Okay. So you're getting because that's the other side of the 8th house is like other people's money or the partner's money, and Jupiter in the 8th ruling the 7th can sometimes be like financial benefits that come through partnership.
Yeah.
It's been both. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's interesting. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. And that's such a good example of like how it can work out differently at different times in your life too.
Right. Yeah. And you can sometimes get the challenging things coming up, but otherwise also the positive things. But that Uranus transit, of course, Uranus takes 84 years to go around the zodiac. So that was basically like a once in a lifetime transit, having it conjoin your moon at that time.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. Did you have one that you wanted to share, or was there another person that wanted to share like a 7th house placement?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
A transit? Yeah, as long as you're pretty certain about the dates. Yeah. Okay. What if you want to come up to the mic? What's your first name?
Michael.
Michael. And what's your birth date?
January 13th, 1985. 2:32 p.m. And it's Killeen, Killeen, Texas.
All right. Is your ascendant 9 Gemini?
Right.
Okay.
And then I don't know if you want to do a bi-wheel, but
sure. What is the target date?
July 1st of 2010.
What time? Or
it would just be like noon.
Yeah,
fine.
That's fine. Okay. So inside wheel is your natal chart. Outside wheel is the transits for July 1st, 2010.
So the way I read this was Mars was aspecting like a square with Uranus in the 7th.
Okay.
And I abruptly like ended a long-term relationship and moved across the country.
Okay.
Like all at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, that can definitely happen that's one of the things about transits that go through angles is they tend to hit all of those angles at the same time. So in your instance, it would be Mars transiting through your 4th house of the home and living situation,
right.
But then squaring both your ascendant-descendant axis as well as that Uranus placement in the 7th house at the same time.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Was it like a thought out thing or
No.
was it an abrupt?
It was like super abrupt.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So abrupt, unexpected, or common like Uranus traits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it was kind of negative too, because like
Okay.
I regretted the move after it happened.
Mm-hmm.
So Mars being the more malefic,
Yeah.
In a
So
day chart.
You're born at the day chart.
and
So
then with the square as well, right? So
a square can be a more challenging aspect. And then it was also opposing your Mars-Venus conjunction, which is in Pisces in the 10th house around the same time.
right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a lot of triggers at once.
Yeah.
Since you have them close in degree. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a good example though.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
All right. Let's set up a few more of the example charts just for the ruler of the 7th house, as well as Venus as a general significator.
Mhm.
Let's see. So, let's see. Not completely depressing ones. Aretha's is kind of interesting. No, too. Okay.
Well, if you were looking for not depressing.
One of my favorite ones was a singular example because this is actually originally this is Steven Spielberg's timed birth chart, and this is originally posed to me as like a challenge by another astrologer who said that the doctrine of sect, the difference between day and night charts didn't work because he said that this is the birth chart of Steven Spielberg. He has a night chart. He was born at just after 6 p.m. with the sun in Sagittarius in the 6th whole sign house, a good 14 degrees below the horizon. So it's firmly a night chart. And he has Saturn in the 2nd whole sign house of money and finances. And of course, as one of the most successful directors in Hollywood, he's also very rich. So the challenge that was posed to me at the time was, why does this super rich millionaire have Saturn in the 2nd house? That obviously doesn't make sense. And I had never looked at his chart before, so I pulled it up and I said, well, what houses does Saturn rule? And is that in any way connected with an event that has happened in his life at some specific point in time? And what I found very quickly is that Saturn is in the 2nd house in a night chart, so it's supposed to be his most difficult placement, but Saturn is the ruler of the 7th house of relationships and the 8th house of shared resources, and it's placed in the 2nd house of his personal finances. And what happened is at one point in the 1980s, that placement was activated, I believe, through annual Profections. It was like he was in a 7th house Profection year or something like that, and I can explain that later. But basically, his 7th house was activated, and he went through a very highly publicized, at the time, divorce, where him and his wife split up, and they'd been married for a while at that point. And what was interesting about that case at the time in the 1980s is they had a prenuptial agreement when they were married in California, but it was like written on a napkin or something like that. And the judge looked at it and he said, what is this? Like, this isn't valid. And he rejected the prenuptial agreement, which then made it so that his wife was then given half of his fortune at the time. And at the time, it ended up being the most costly celebrity divorce in history at that point in like the late 1980s, which is something that, at least for him subjectively, he was not very happy about and viewed as a negative event that occurred at some point in his life when that Saturn placement was activated in his 2nd house, with it ruling the 7th house and the 8th house. So that's one of those instances, like we were talking about earlier, where while it's true that some of these placements can indicate persistent or recurring themes in relationships in a person's life, or even something that'll come up several times, there can be other placements that don't come up persistently, but instead may indicate like a one-time major event that happens at some point in the person's life that can come to characterize it in some significant way. Or if somebody wrote a biography about his life and his relationships in particular, they would have like a section on this divorce and the circumstances that happened when they went through it.
Mm-hmm. And so that's really good to know that some of the things can be episodic, that they're not throughout your entire life typifying your relationships, particularly if you have challenges with regard to your relationships. I knew someone else who had Mars ruling the 7th in the 12th conjunct Pluto in a day chart. And so you have the most challenging planet in a day chart ruling the 7th house of partnership and placed in the 12th house. And she had a very abusive relationship for some time, but then later on in her life, she was happily remarried and it was not abusive. And some of that showed in the timing. So it's important to know if there are challenging placements that it won't always be equally so throughout the entire life necessarily.
Right. So I don't have a diagram for Profections, but that's one of the timing techniques that we commonly use to figure out when different parts of the chart are going to be activated or when specific house placements are going to be activated or specific transits. So all you have to do is start with the rising sign, whatever sign your ascendant is located in, and that sign and its ruler are activated for the first year of your life. Then after that first year is finished, it moves downwards to the second sign in zodiacal order, the sign just after the rising sign, and it activates that sign and its ruler for the second year of your life. And you just keep counting forward one sign each year for every year that the native is alive. And it comes back to the rising sign every 12 years. So at 12 years old, at 24 years old, 36, and so on and so forth. So Steven Spielberg was actually it activated Capricorn in his 7th house in the year that this divorce took place. So it's one of the timing techniques that you can use to figure out when the specific parts of the chart or the specific placements and whatever is promised by those placements will actually be delivered or will manifest.
Mm-hmm. And some of the quick ways you can check that are the 7th house years, which are always going to be like age 18, 30, 42, etc. Keep adding 12 years. So the 7th house years should bring out more of the 7th house placements. And you can also look at the Profection years that highlight where the planet that rules the 7th is, because sometimes that'll activate that as well.
Yeah. So I think back in my first example, the guy that had the really positive placement in his 7th house for relationships, he was 18 years old when he met the love of his life, and 18 years old is a 7th house Profection year. So it's activating Cancer and that Venus placement in his 7th house.
Mm-hmm.
But another example is Joe Biden. Going back to that one, he was 30 years old when he lost his first wife in that car accident. So that was activating Gemini, but also the two planets in that sign, which are Saturn and Uranus.
Mm-hmm.
So what are other? So 7th house Profection years are like 18,
30, 42, and keep adding 12.
42.
Yeah. 54. Yes.
Yeah. So everybody can think of those years in your life and think about, especially if you have important placements in the 7th house, then that could have been an important year for you for relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So 18, 30, 42,
mm-hmm.
and 54.
54, so 66.
Okay.
And 78.
Yeah, and I did on the astrologypodcast.com, one of the episodes is on annual Profections, and it has like a diagram and a worksheet for people to calculate their Profections if anyone wants to check that out later.
Mm-hmm. And when I was mentioning also the Profection years where the ruler of the 7th is placed, I had a client just the other day and with the ruler of the 7th and the 12th. And I said, well, one of the things that means is you might have more relationship activity during 12th house years, so that's 11, 23, 35, 47, etc. And then asked later about when she met someone who was like a long time on and off relationship. And she said 23. I said, oh, okay, good. So it really does work.
Okay, so just a few more. Let's throw some examples up of the ruler of this 7th and it indicating something about the context of relationships at different points in the person's life. So This is my friend, an astrologer, Nick Dagan Best. He actually came and spoke for the group several years ago, probably
Early on.
Yeah, very early, maybe 2011 or something like that. Uh, he has Leo rising and he has Aquarius on the 7th house. And the traditional ruler of Aquarius is Saturn. And if we look to where Saturn is placed as the ruler of the 7th house, it will carry out the topics of the 7th house of relationships wherever it's placed in the chart. So we find Saturn in his chart in the 9th house of travel, foreign places, also the place of religion, astrology, education. But the 9th house especially is the place of like foreign places and foreign people. What ended up happening is that several years ago, he went and attended an astrology conference in South Africa. He's originally from Montreal, Canada. He attended this astrology conference in South Africa, and he ended up meeting a woman there from South Africa. They ended up falling in love and getting married, and now he's lived abroad in South Africa for the past several years. So basically, if you were to try to boil this placement down to a specific sentence, if you're just looking at this chart, this client just walks in off the street, one of the most simple things you could come up with as a delineation of this placement is that with the ruler of the 7th house of relationships in the 9th house of foreign things, that the native might be married to a foreigner or meet an important relationship partner in a foreign place while traveling at some point in their life. And if you were to make that statement to him when he was 15, it might not be true and it might seem like a very wild statement, but at some point in his life, that statement would have become strikingly accurate when it was eventually activated.
Yeah, I've seen that combination go that way over and over. People married to someone from another country or going on a trip to another country and then meeting someone they get in a relationship with.
Yeah, it also sometimes works in the reverse, like when the ruler of the 9th is in the 7th. So this is Giselle Bundchen, who has Capricorn rising. She has Virgo on the 9th whole sign house of foreign places and foreign travel. And the ruler of the 9th house is Mercury, the ruler of Virgo. And Mercury is placed in Cancer in the 7th house, exactly conjunct the degree of the descendant. And she's originally from Brazil, and she became a supermodel, and she ended up marrying like an American quarterback. So the delineation is that she ended up marrying somebody that was from a foreign country from where she grew up, with the ruler of the 9th house of foreign places and foreign people in the 7th house of relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. So is that clear? Are people like understanding the general point in terms of looking at the ruler of the 7th house and where it's placed, and that's sometimes indicating something important about the context of relationships or where they might meet an important relationship partner at some point in their life? Let me see if did we have other examples like that we meant to share?
I had Macron, Emmanuel Macron.
Okay.
If it's good for this, it's good for a couple things.
Okay. So go ahead.
Yeah, so Emmanuel Macron is the head of France right now, and he's kind of famously known for being married to someone who's about 25 years older than him, who was his French teacher in high school. And so it's kind of a unique circumstance, right? So that made me laugh when I looked at his chart because he has Jupiter in Cancer in the 7th house of partnership. And one of the houses that Jupiter is ruling is the 3rd house. And the 3rd house is the house of education that's not higher education. So before that. So while that could have meant a classmate, it happened to mean his teacher. But what actually made me laugh some more is, looking at the ruler of the 7th, it's the moon exalted in Taurus in the 5th house. And the ruler of the 7th and the 5th isn't always super specific. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. But I was reading an article that said that she actually also taught a drama class on the side, and he took her drama class, and they were like co-writing a play together, and that's how like they fell in love. And that's the 5th house. It's like creative pursuits, and arts often goes in the 5th house. So anyway, both of those placements, both the ruler of the 3rd in the 7th and the ruler of the 7th in the 5th, fit very well the circumstances of how he met her. And the other thing that's really interesting about this one is the moon is, you would normally not think that would necessarily last. He has the ruler of the 7th, the moon, exactly opposed Uranus. And that's often about exciting things that are unconventional relationships, but maybe like fleeting. But what struck me is the moon is exalted in Taurus, and it's like the most stable moon that you can have in Taurus. So even though it's opposed Uranus, in this case, they've been married for quite a while at this point. It just typified a very unconventional relationship with like a major age difference, but that has stayed steady so far. So I thought those several things about this chart with regard to relationships really stuck out.
Yeah, so pay attention to when you have a placement in the 7th house, pay attention to what houses that planet rules, because it will sometimes import the topics of those houses into the context of relationships.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at her, actually, go back to his just for a second. It's wide by degree, but he does have a Venus-Saturn square by sign as well, which can sometimes also indicate age differences in relationships. And I'm only pointing that out even though it's quite wide by degree, because if you go to hers, she actually has that really tightly.
What is her name again?
Brigitte Macron. It's up further, about number 14. Yeah. So she has Venus at almost 23 Aries, opposed Saturn by a degree. So a similar sort of Venus placement, which we haven't brought up yet, just the general significator as Venus.
Yeah, so that's the third thing to look for is, so number 1 is planets in the 7th house. Number 2 is the ruler of the 7th house. But the third thing is just Venus as the general significator for love and relationships in a person's life in general. And sometimes it's placement in the chart, it's condition by zodiacal sign, and especially its aspects, especially close aspects with other planets in the chart, will typify something about the general theme of love and relationships in their life and the types of relationships that they'll tend to gravitate towards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so she has a tight Venus-Saturn opposition, and Venus-Saturn can be age differences. And then if you look at the ruler of her 7th house, it's Jupiter in the 9th conjoined the midheaven. And that's kind of interesting to me as well, because, they met when he was not the head of France. He was 15 years old. And so that's another good example of how some of those placements can be really important in describing a partner or a partnership at some point in your life, but it's not necessarily obvious throughout your entire life. But now she's married to the head of France.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a good example where Venus, Saturn, hard aspects, especially like a conjunction, square, or opposition, are very commonly typified by, or one of the classical ones that's been true for most of the tradition is like age disparities, that sometimes when a person has Saturn prominently connected with the relationship sectors in the chart, which can be the 7th house or the ruler of the 7th, but especially Venus-Saturn aspects, that age disparities or some sort of major disparity can occur or be present in the person's relationships.
Yeah, and it can go either way. It could be much younger or much older.
Right. So typically like a person that either tends to date people that are much older than them or a person that tends to date people that are much younger than them is pretty common of Saturn-Venus aspects. In some of the older like traditional texts, they also talk about like class disparities and other things like that, or having a partner that has some sort of issue or disability as a potential delineation comes up in a lot of the traditional texts.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely age disparities is a very common one for modern delineations.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have other chart examples of just general Venus?
Yeah. Elizabeth Taylor is a great general Venus one.
All right.
So Elizabeth Taylor has Venus in Aries, and it's tightly conjunct Uranus. And I thought that was a really interesting one because she was married 8 times. And that would be notable in itself, right? That's a lot of marriages. But in addition to that, at least several of them were people she met and started dating before she was, basically while she was still married to the previous person. So Venus in Aries can be a little bit more impulsive. That's where you're paying attention to the sign. And then the Venus-Uranus combination obviously can be sort of prone to want novelty in their relationships. Yeah.
Sure.
So it can be an unconventional relationship. It can just be like the on and off kind of thing where you're suddenly excited and then suddenly done.
Yeah. So anytime there's a very close, especially Venus-Uranus aspect in the chart, especially hard aspects, it can be things like that, like relationships that start off very suddenly or very rapidly, but also relationships that cool down or end very rapidly or unexpectedly. What else? Relationships that are eccentric or unique, or where the person is attracted to a relationship partner that has some sort of eccentricity or something highly unique about them from like a societal standpoint.
Yeah.
What else?
I mean, sometimes it can go the way of the Venus Saturn in terms of age differences, but it's usually like lots of different differences. It's not specific to age, only in that that's one way a relationship can be unconventional.
Yeah. So, and part of that is just that Venus as a general significator of love and relationships can tend to indicate the types of things that a person is attracted to, or the types of people, or the types of relationship scenarios that you're attracted to. So that's why it's important to pay attention to if Venus is very closely aspected by a planet in the chart. That's going to color or just typify the relationships that they'll gravitate towards in very distinct ways. All right. So yeah, that Venus-Uranus conjunction at 17 degrees of Aries is super close. Obviously, there's other stuff going on in her chart. Venus is also like trining Jupiter. And there's like lots of relationships, but it's also Venus is closely squaring Pluto. So there's some struggles there and some difficulties. Yeah.
Yeah, and then if you extend it to the 7th house ruler, that's Mercury in Pisces in the 4th house, and it's opposed pretty closely by that Neptune. So, and many of her husbands, although not all of them, were also movie stars, which is not terribly unique if you're also a movie star, because that's how you tend to meet people. But I could see that kind of starry-eyed kind of, glamour coming over the next person she met, even though she was already married, which is the Neptune.
Sure. So any other statements? So we talked about Venus-Saturn. We've talked about Venus-Uranus, Venus-Neptune. Even though it's not connected with Venus, it's connected with the ruler of the 7th. Maybe some significations for that.
Venus-Neptune? Yeah, idealistic love, I would say. And oftentimes seeing the best in people, but needing to get your feet on the ground or needing to remind yourself to get your feet on the ground more than average in order to see the grounded reality of what's really there, either with the connection with the person or with the person themselves.
Right. That's the most like ideal scenario, but more commonly just
that's the advice.
That's the advice sector, but the reality is more frequently if you were that person's friend, like they're coming to you and saying they literally just met the love of their life at the train station and they're pretty sure they're going to be together for the rest of their life. And this is the one, but this is like the 5th or like 10th time that they've done that just in the past like month or something.
Yeah. Venus-Neptune can fall in love easily or fall in the illusion of love easily. It's very romantic.
Yeah, but sometimes it's not realistic and they can tend to see more of an illusion or more of the ideal scenario of the partner that they're looking at through sort of like rose-colored glasses rather than what's actually in front of them, or in sometimes overlooking the cracks and the shortcomings or the ways in which that relationship is not ideal.
Right.
But then eventually, oftentimes what will happen is at some point, the reality will start to like seep through in the relationship. And sometimes it can be a switch that happens suddenly where the person can go from over idealizing the relationship or the relationship partner to the opposite and just focusing entirely on their sense of disillusionment and the person being all of these negative things that suddenly they realize. And then sometimes it can become skewed in the opposite direction of only seeing the negative things so that they can sometimes just flip and then go out of the relationship feeling the other way.
Yeah, exactly. Neptune can just struggle to keep proper perspective. And so with Venus-Neptune conjunctions or hard aspects in general, it can be either illusion or disillusionment, but not necessarily the middle ground of like seeing exactly who the person is very clearly. And all of these combinations can also be extended. Then we're talking about the natal chart or natal placement combinations, but those can be extended to transits to some degree if you have those transits to your natal Venus at some point.
Yeah, if like transiting Venus is or transiting Neptune is going over your natal Venus, especially through a hard aspect, it'll come out very strongly. Or if Neptune is going through your seventh house, especially if it's conjoining a planet in the seventh house or conjoining the degree of the descendant, or even if transiting Neptune is making a hard aspect to the ruler of your seventh house, then some of those themes can become present in your life, even if you don't have a natal predisposition or tendency towards that. Everybody has that experience at some point in their life, and it can be when you have a heavy Neptune transit like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so not seeing something until later on, even if it was maybe right in front of you.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So the last one we didn't cover is like Pluto in connection with relationships.
Venus, Pluto.
Yeah, like Venus, Pluto, or to some extent Venus in connection with the ruler of the seventh or in the seventh.
Yeah, I mean, Venus, Pluto is known for intensity in relationships. That's a really generic statement that can often be true, and that I'm saying it generically because it can be positive intensity or less than positive intensity, you know? So sometimes they can be like very intense, highly sexual relationships, for instance, where you're just like super drawn to each other and obsessed with each other. But then it can also be the negative side of Pluto, such as, what are like Venus, Pluto, like intense jealousy, intense, what else?
Like obsession.
Yeah, obsession can kind of feel positive or negative, I guess.
I mean, it could be positive in the sense of like your undying love and like focus and devotion to a person. But if you're like on the receiving end of that and you're not feeling that intense, it can be like the stalker type scenario where somebody intensely is attached to somebody and it's not reciprocated, for example.
Yeah, definitely. Betrayal can also be like a Venus Pluto thing, like dealing with either like worrying about being betrayed or being actually betrayed. So,
and not to emphasize all the negative things, because the positive things is that intensity, when properly channeled, can be, somebody that's willing to go to great lengths for love or for relationships beyond the normal boundaries that anyone else would ever go. And that can certainly, when channeled properly, be like a positive thing or a positive trait.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. All right. So those are most of I did a podcast episode with Kay Taylor titled Outer Planets and Relationships, and that was a really good treatment of the outer planets when connected with some of these things, if people want to listen more about that. What are some of the examples that we wanted to, or should we take some charts?
I think just some of the other topics that we wanted to mention at some point are some of the timing things. We did mention profections and transits. Zodiacal releasing from the lot of Eros is also something that we use for timing with relationships. And I find that it's super important. We're not going to be able to really get into the details of it today, but I find it very important in terms of almost being an extension of the birth chart in terms of how much it determines whether there's opportunities or not opportunities for some of those natal placements to manifest with regard to relationships. And so I just see that a lot with client charts in terms of the windows of time within which they either meet people or don't meet people, basically.
Sure. So there's just other techniques like zodiac releasing that instead of focusing on narrow spans of time, it breaks the entire life up into chapters and subsections as if the life was a book, and you could identify the different chapter breaks and some of the more active chapters and some of the chapters where there's not as much going on. And that techniques like that can sometimes be useful for setting a much broader context for understanding where in the overall chronology of a person's life a person is for relationships, which is just useful if you're trying to see things from a bird's eye view, as opposed to transits, which tend to be narrowed down to more narrow or specific frames of time.
And we did a whole podcast on that as well.
Yeah, on zodiac releasing.
On zodiac releasing. So it's not specific to relationships in that one, but you can apply it to relationships.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anybody have like a good example or story of any of the placements that we've been talking about with like a Venus close Venus aspect in your chart that's connected with Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, and a story that's like stood out in your life? You have one? All right, come up to the mic. Let's put your chart up.
What's your first name? And your birth date?
December 15th, 1979 at 11:30 a.m. in Denver. So I have a little bit of everything.
Okay, so you have
yeah.
Pisces rising and
Yep.
Mars and Jupiter and Saturn in the North Node and Virgo in the 7th house,
Just a few, yeah.
right?
I also have the Venus square Pluto in the 11th and the 8th.
Okay, so Venus is at 21 Capricorn in the 11th house, and it's squaring Pluto within actually almost exactly to the minute.
Yes.
And Pluto's at 21 Libra in the 8th house.
And the Saturn Pluto conjunction was directly on my Venus. So
Okay,
that's been
right.
really
So Venus
fun.
is at 21, and the Saturn Pluto conjunction was at 24?
Yep.
23. Yeah.
23, okay.
Yeah.
So that happened just recently?
Yeah, I'm just going to take full credit for the full conjunction because it really
Right.
doesn't really matter at this point. I think I actually had a couple questions, primarily with sect and mitigating factors.
Okay.
Because I have a day chart and Jupiter is going to be the most benefic in the day.
Mhm.
It's also conjunct Mars, which is the malefic of the day,
Right.
on my Ascendant
Sure.
in the 7th.
Okay, so for
So-
everyone else, because I hadn't mentioned the
Yeah.
negative correlate to the positive ones. So I've said in a day chart, Jupiter's the most positive. In a night chart, Venus is the most positive. But then for the malefic, the challenging planets, in a day chart, Mars is the most challenging planet. Whereas in a night chart, Saturn is the most challenging planet. And so this is one of those instances where you have the most challenging planet, Mars, and the most positive planet, Jupiter, in the 7th house. So there's extremes of both challenging things as well as some of the most positive things in the same sector of your life.
And it's on an angle too. So,
Right. So it's super prominent because
Yeah.
it's right on the degree of the descendant.
Yeah. It's so it kind of feels like I've had a hard time when looking even at my chart, let alone telling other people with confidence, like this is what to expect, because I, in my own chart, get a little lost. Saturn is actually, I think, sextiling Venus in my chart. Is that
Trine.
Trining, yeah. So then, which then affects the Pluto thing. So everything is so tightly connected with mine. I tend to get a little lost, but I did want to kind of talk primarily about like sect and mitigating factors, just because I have that. And so I just wanted to, I know there's so many things on there that relate to relationships that you guys were talking about, but primarily just that and how to kind of appropriately interpret that when you have something like that.
What has your experience been so far? What are some of the characteristic things?
I am patient to a point, and then I am just kind of like, go ahead and just get it done. If I seem to attract people that are more reserved, which is good initially, but over time tend to kind of allow me to do more of that. And then there's a little bit of frustration in just, why can't you just do this? Why can't you just do it? You know, so I tend to be more action oriented in relationship. And so for me, I tend to run into that often where I'm like, okay, but can't you just do it? Why can't you see that? Why can't you just
in a sense of like not impulsivity?
Well, like from the daily routine, right? The Virgo piece, just on a day-to-day basis, just kind of getting things done, just one step and just kind of more orderly, and everything seems to, I tend to take more of that on.
Sure.
And then, yeah. So that's usually what I tend to default to is like, okay, I'm just going to do it. I'll just do it.
Okay.
Then I get burnout. So
I'm curious, because you were asking about Mars and Jupiter being both the most positive and the most challenging in the 7th house. oftentimes people, if they have both in the 7th, they, over the course of their lifetime at least, experience some of both.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's in the same relationship, and sometimes that's in different relationships.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, since we were wondering about the anecdotes with regard to your life experience, have you had major relationships that really have been evocative of either or both of those placements? Like really strongly positive, really strongly challenging?
No, I think it's just kind of felt like a grind.
Okay, like
Just
a grind.
Just a grind, kind of overall.
And
and Saturn's in there too.
Yeah, but I mean, like I kind of like that to a point. So that's where I'm like, I'm good until I'm not, and then it's just I'm not.
What's the best thing that's ever happened to you in relationships?
The best thing.
Or
the
if you
best
want to
thing
start
is tied with the worst thing. So there you go.
What's the worst thing that's ever happened to you in relationships?
The worst thing. Honestly, it actually hasn't been in romantic relationships. I actually, I mean, I guess you can, whatever. I got divorced a couple of years ago, but as I was getting divorced, my whole family and all of them sided with my ex-husband for whatever reason. They're still fairly unclear. So, and I was very close with my family, like really, really close with my family, and now I don't talk to them.
So you suffered
that
like
could be the Pluto Saturn thing, honestly, but yes. Yeah.
So a traumatic divorce where you had a separation from not just your marriage partner, but also your family and other people that were connected with you at the time.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of like that's where everything gets a little lost because it's easy to see it in a couple of different spots in my chart. So especially with the transit.
Part of it's coming through the connection, because one of the rules we didn't explain earlier was that you pay attention to the ruler of the 7th house, but also sometimes the other house that same planet rules will bring those topics into play when it gets activated. So in your instance, Mercury is the ruler of the 7th house, but it's also the ruler of the 4th house. So that activation can activate both relationships and family at the same time.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's actually applying to square Mars as the first aspect. So in a day chart, so that actually is a perfect description of that. Unfortunately, yeah. But that's where some of the Mars has showed up. I think,
right.
Yeah.
So in terms of mitigations, though, you do have 2 mitigating factors. One of them is that while you do have the most positive planet and the negative planet in the 7th house, Mars is actually applying to a conjunction with Jupiter within 3 degrees, and that's a condition known in the ancient Hellenistic text as bonification, where the positive planet has the upper hand and is able to kind of force the more negative planet to be better, or at least somewhat more mild than it would be otherwise.
Yeah.
So while Mars in the 7th house would still indicate that that's where you're going to have some of your greatest challenges or difficulties, it's not going to be as extremely negative as it potentially could be without that mitigating condition. The other mitigating condition that's relevant is while Venus has that close square with Pluto, Jupiter has a superior sign-based trine overcoming Venus. Even though it's not very close by degree, that's actually still very important and very relevant because Jupiter is earlier in the order of signs. It's, again, able to balance out the condition of Venus and make it more positive than it would be otherwise. And there's actually one more, reception. Right?
Yeah,
that's what I was just going to ask you about.
Because Mercury is ruling all those Virgo planets, and it's in Sagittarius. So while it is applying to square Mars next, it has reception with all of those since it's an applying aspect to all those planets and rules them. And so it kind of tempers what would otherwise be a more extreme situation, particularly of the Mercury-Mars.
When do you see Saturn having reception with Venus and Saturn?
Yeah, that was actually the reception I was going to mention. Because Venus is in...
But that's good. I didn't see that.
Yeah, you have multiple receptions.
Venus is in Saturn's sign, and it's applying to a trine with it. I mean, one of the questions that I'd have, and if it hasn't come up so far in your life, it may at some point, is just with the ruler of the 7th house of relationships and the 10th house of career, that there may be a relationship that comes up at some point in your life that is connected with your career, your work, or that somehow your relationship or your love life becomes tied in with your career, like through working with a partner at some point.
Right. And then that has not happened yet.
Okay.
So I'm thinking that's hopefully coming. Hoping that the Saturn-Pluto conjunction on all of this basically triggering everything is kind of clearing the way for a serious reboot.
Why did you say that conjunction was relevant recently? Because that was only within the past month?
Well, I've felt that just kind of coming with Saturn transiting Sag, leading up to it. It's kind of been like a slow buildup. It's been a slow, and then it's accelerated in terms of the things that have kind of had to leave or have just left without, me having any sort of control over it. So it's been kind of a slow tilling of the garden. And then now it's just been like a bulldozer.
Okay.
So I think it's just been it's been leading up to it. So now that it's happened, I'm hopefully on the other side of it. I know Saturn's going to come back and revisit, but I think the worst is over. I think. I haven't met anyone at work or anything like that. So
when was the divorce?
2017.
Okay.
It was final July 17th of 2017.
2017.
So that would have been Saturn square Saturn in the 7th. Yeah, Saturn in Sagittarius square Saturn in Virgo.
Yep.
Okay.
So.
And that was probably the end of like a process.
It was actually a fast one.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty quick.
Interesting.
That was the least painful part of it. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
You have a really complex,
I know,
interconnected thing.
That's
going
why
on
I'm
with
like, this
relationships.
is so the one I need to go to today.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just had a hard time primarily with the Mars Jupiter conjunction on my descendant in the 7th. So thank
Sure.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just some of the most positive things and some of the more challenging things
Yeah.
would come up in the spheres of relationships, but that's also one of the most important areas of your life because the ruler of the ascendant, the ruler of the 10th is located in that house. So,
and I think you did a podcast on that recently where you kind of have to take the good with the bad within the last year.
right.
So that was helpful. But yeah, I was like, how does this relate to me? So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. All right. Does anyone else have any other good retrospective examples? You have a good story you want to share? Or?
I just have very quick placement and a story.
Okay.
It's my whole life.
Sure. What's your first name?
Lynette. Lynnett.
What's your birth date?
February 7th, 1982.
What time?
8:12 p.m. Albuquerque, New Mexico. ALBU.
Yeah, sorry.
It's a hard one.
What? How do you spell it again?
ALBUQU.
UQ. Okay.
Yeah. UER. Wait. For UE.
ALBUQU.
Yes.
ER.
QUE.
QU.
I'm also really bad at spelling out loud.
ER.
QUE. Wait.
Q.
What are we
No.
missing?
Is it still not?
Albu.
ALB.
Okay.
QU.
ER.
QUE.
Yes.
QUE. Okay. New Mexico.
I think there's an extra U in there. But it looks like you found it.
I think it works.
Yeah.
Solidify may have
Cool.
built in
Yeah, there you
spell
go.
check. All right. 21 Virgo rising.
Yes.
Okay.
So my Venus is square Saturn / Pluto. I also with the Saturn Pluto conjunction, it's over my south node. Basically the only relationship I've had since I was 22 years old was with someone who was 22 years older than me.
Okay.
And we basically we're still in the process, but we just started separating right around the 12th. When it was exact.
The 12th of last month.
Of
Okay.
January.
Yeah. That was actually
The day of the
Yeah.
conjunction. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really great example. So just
It's so great.
well,
We're sorry.
No,
We're
it's
sorry.
amicable.
it's astrologer good.
But it's it's actually the age difference that has led to the separation.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Because that is a Venus Saturn thing we were discussing earlier.
So that initially that was something that was present or that's always been present in your relationship, but then eventually it became an issue or a point of strain between you?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we also, you were talking about the Pluto, and I'm not sure how strong this is, but we've obviously been together a really long time, and we were in long distance for 3.5 years of that as well across the course of the relationship. So
Okay.
it was interesting too.
Yeah, and so just if anybody's listening to the recording of this, so your Venus is at 23 Capricorn and it's square Saturn at 22 Libra and Pluto at 26 Libra. And the recent Saturn-Pluto conjunction was at 23 Capricorn. So it was right on top of that. And that was when just a month ago you guys decided to split up.
It'd been in the works actually for 3 years.
Okay.
The main thing is that I want to have a baby and he's older and different life stages. So we started talking about it it's been very slow. But as of a month ago, it was kind of like the deciding thing.
That's actually perfect also because Venus is in the 5th house, which is the place of children.
And Saturn is ruling the 5th house.
Saturn's ruling, but it's not just that. It's also like that whole transit. This is a good demonstration of sign-based transits, how they start as soon as the planet goes into the sign, but then they usually culminate at the exact hit. So Saturn moved into Capricorn back in like December of 2017. So that was about 2-3 years ago now. Saturn moved into Capricorn and sort of some of those issues probably started to come up and continued to grow more intense the closer and closer the transit gets to the exact conjunction with Venus until it finally hits it there at 23. And then that's when the sort of culmination of the events. Yeah. Cool. Thank you for sharing that. That's a really good
Thank
example.
you for the example.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So where are we at right now? We've got about 30 minutes left.
Yeah, a little more. I'm trying to think of any of the pieces we haven't talked about. I mean, we could go into all of the different house connections. I don't know if you want to or not. In terms of how that can show up.
In terms of just delineating all 12 houses?
Yeah.
Maybe. That might take up a lot of time, though.
Yeah. You can do it quickly. But I don't know if there was anything else that you wanted to bring in conceptually besides that.
Conceptually, so relationship stuff, because we wanted to cover basically a little bit of everything today. So we've covered placements in the 7th, ruler of the 7th. Venus is a general significator. Transits. So transits through the 7th house, transits to Venus, transits to the ruler of the 7th house. We talked very briefly about zodiac releasing. We talked briefly about profections, activating the 7th house especially. What else? Synastry is something we didn't really touch on. So comparing two charts to each other.
Right.
And especially sometimes when you have the same placements on the same degrees, that's going to indicate a sensitive point when a transit goes over that, because then it's going to hit both of your charts at the same time, which is part of the reason why synastry is important, because then your timing becomes inextricably interlinked with events in your life, sometimes happening around the same time. What other relationship concepts are there?
I'm sure we're forgetting something, but I'm not thinking of it right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any good retrospective examples like the last one that they want to share with us? You have one? Is it a good example? You seem a little hesitant.
I just wanted to make sure everyone was I talked a lot.
Okay.
Is it a quick example?
Yeah, it's got to be quick. That's the only thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
January 25th, 89. 11:23 p.m. Denver.
Okay. 21 Libra rising.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I just turned 31, so now I'm in a 8th house perfection, but I was just through a 7th house perfection year. And so the last few months were definitely between October and then all the way up until recently in January, were very active regarding love relationships for me. It started off with the full moon that happened in October in Aries. And I was like, okay, something's going to happen. It's a full moon in the perfection house. And then about a week or so later, I met somebody on the internet and we started talking about a week later. And he's like, I want to move in with you. And it was the first time probably in 12 years since I had lived with somebody. And it was kind of scary and nerve wracking to me. But I took a chance. And so I ended up moving in, and the relationship only lasted about 2 months, because then the eclipse that followed, the Capricorn eclipse fell on my natal Uranus and trined my natal Mars. So what ended up happening was we had a very, it was a happy relationship. It was actually like very harmonious. We had a lot, we got along with, but then he started to become like a financial burden to me since Mars rules my second house. And so it was starting to become like a thing where I was like, hey, I need you to get a job. And he was like, oh, no, I'll try. And so that started becoming a problem.
So he did move in with you?
Yeah, he did.
Okay.
Yeah, he moved all the way from Louisiana to move in with me.
After like
a week
of talking? Okay.
A week of
So
dating.
this is Mars ruling the 7th house, exactly, trine Uranus.
It's a 7th house perfection year. So the 7th house is activated, and it's activating the ruler of the 7th house, which is Mars, in the 8th house of shared resources, and also ruling the 2nd house of personal finances.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I was like, spending credit cards and stuff to try and help him, like, have clothes for the winter because he came from the South and all sorts of stuff. So it started just becoming like a burden, I started feeling like some strife and conflict with that.
Mhm.
And then the eclipse that happened made it so that way, like, the breakup was very smooth and very peaceful, which was very not usual for like what I've experienced with having Mars in, ruling the 7th in the 8th square Mercury and the Sun. I've had a lot of abusive relationships in the past. So for one, that wasn't traumatizing, and to like break up very peacefully. And it wasn't like we were decided that we were done. It was just a school opportunity got presented, and he was like, I need to take this position. And I was like, yeah, I'm not going to hold you back. It was a very caring.
And this was after you're talking about the Capricorn eclipse in December?
The one at 4 degrees?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So that was in your 4th house of your home
wasn't
and
that like
living
Christmas
situation.
or something?
Yeah, January or December 26th, yeah.
Yeah. So that was right around the time that he got the acceptance letter and stuff like that from the school. And so it was very, we're still friends, and he moved out peacefully, but it's one of those things where it's like, I thought I wanted a relationship, and it was very, had a lot of positive experiences from it, but it was very swift. I learned a lot of lessons real quick, and it turned out to be one of those things where it's like, it was a burden, or like it felt like I liked the relationship, but then it was like, I didn't like the relationship. It was a very conflicting, almost a frustrating feeling of like dissatisfaction. And so, I'm kind of like glad that that's over. It's not like it was abusive, but it was definitely different from what I had went through usually.
Mhm.
And so,
Sure. So and the timing is great in terms of, so the eclipse happened then in your 4th house in December, and then not long after that, then he moved out. So your living situation changed. And then just a few weeks later, at the end of January, you ended that perfection year, and it moved out of your 7th house and into your 8th house.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that whole relationship year was over, and the relationship itself came to an end.
Yeah. And that was like, a very major thing for me, because it was the first time in a very long time I'd been in an actual like Facebook official serious relationship where we were intending on, but it just was so sudden and swift that it ended too, with the eclipse falling on Uranus, on my natal Uranus. That
That's a good example of transit as well, with Uranus transiting over Mars in a 7th house here, where Mars is activated as the ruler, because Uranus has, of course, been going through the first few degrees of Taurus back and forth. And so it would have been around that maybe when you met, and then it went back to about 2.5 when it's stationed in January.
Yeah. So
When did it station?
definitely was impulsive.
It's stationed
yeah.
around that 3-day
The 10th.
span. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. So it's stationed at 2 degrees of Taurus.
Yeah. So all before that, it would have been like right on top of your Mars.
It's conjoining Mars,
Yeah.
the ruler of the 7th. Okay,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
And I forgot, because we used your example in one of the previous meetings last year, but part of the reason that 7th house perfection year and that greater activity of relationships was notable for you, because you hadn't had a major relationship in like quite a long time up until this year, right?
Right, exactly. A serious, like, real relationship where, I actually felt like it was something that meant something to me.
Mhm.
Yeah. The other was like passing dates here and there was like, I really don't care, but they weren't meaningful like this was, and the way that it meant to me.
Mhm.
Sure.
And the way I feel like it was a catalyst in my life for growth, and like feeling like, hey, I now know I can have healthy and successful relationships. Now it's just deciding whether or not I want to be in one,
Definitely.
So yeah.
Cool. Thanks for
Great.
sharing that. That's a
Thank
really good
you.
example. All right. So were there any other celebrity charts that we really wanted to share or needed to share?
Let's see.
So we have like a recent one was like Meghan Markle, who is married to Prince Harry, of course, and she has the ruler of the 7th house of relationships in the 4th house of the home and living situation, which is kind of interesting recently because they decided that they were going to relinquish some of their titles as royals and like move abroad to like Canada, or I'm not sure if it's been decided yet, but
right, just to move away from England. So it's really interesting because she got into a relationship with someone from overseas, and she has the ruler of the 9th, Jupiter, exactly conjunct Saturn, the ruler of the 7th. So that's another way that can bring those topics together besides being in each other's houses. And then, the entire world is like watching which continent they're going to move to, or that's sort of like a very serious decision about moving away from England after a few years of living there with Prince Harry.
Well, then part of it is also that it was motivated, the changes that they're making their living situation and their titles is motivated due to just a constant barrage of like attacks from the media and from the press and paparazzi that she's experienced since marrying him in the past few years. And a lot of this has been coinciding with Saturn transiting through Capricorn and through her 7th house of relationships. She also has a night chart, so it's a little bit more challenging of a transit for her. But then it culminated in January when they made that decision and made that announcement. And that was right around the time of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction at 23 Capricorn, which is right on her descendant at 24 Capricorn.
Yeah, the timing is pretty exact with this one. And it's also interesting because it was the Saturn-Pluto conjunction and those transits through her 7th were squaring her natal Pluto in the 4th. She has a bunch of 4th house placements here. And you could see that kind of dredging up both the conflicts with her father, but also like Pluto in the 4th being like dealing with a very powerful family, and all of the decisions they were making were in the context of that. And it was, her partner's family. But I just thought that was an interesting thing as well. And with all of those 4th house placements, and all of the publicity, I could see someone like her really wanting her private life. And that I feel like that's kind of what those transits triggering those 4th house placements were attesting to.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, his chart was interesting as a Profection example, just because when they got married a few years ago, he was in a 10th house Profection year, and he has Venus in Libra in its own sign in the 10th house natally. So that Venus placement was really being activated in that year, and they had major public marriage, which then now evidently we know in retrospect would then affect in a significant way his career and his social standing in the future.
Yeah. And of course, since he's Capricorn rising and she's Cancer rising, they've both been having eclipses across their first 7th house axis.
And that's a really common theme that we see in this couple's chart, which is that they have their ascendant-descendant axis reversed. And I think that's partially the modern concept of people tending to attract or look for what's on the 7th house and what's on the descendant. So sometimes you will see if you have whatever your rising sign is, pay attention to if you tend to attract people that have the opposite rising sign, because that will sometimes happen and sometimes stand out as an important relationship, or sometimes the other two signs that are square that can be more prominent as well.
And their ascendants being reversed are really interesting in the context of the Saturn-Pluto transits as well, because with the 7th house transit, it was not only, this very serious relationship in marriage and then eventuating in this major break with, at least half break with his family, but that you could see that kind of happening in her 7th house, meaning he was in some ways really grappling with it. And here that's transiting his 1st house, mirroring that this is a major identity shift for him. And, so his 1st house, her 7th house of partnership. Because he's the one that's really tied into this. She's kind of implicated in it by marriage, but.
Well, it was funny though, in one of the papers that people laughed at was it said it was referring to like Meghan Markle, and it referred to Harry as like Meghan Markle's
husband.
Yeah. Meghan Markle's husband or something like that. Instead of like Prince Harry, it was reversed a little bit. And you might be seeing a little bit of that coming through this axis of her having this like 7th house transit and him having this heavy like 1st house transit.
Yeah.
All right. Other ones, we pulled up a bunch today. One that was interesting was like Monica Lewinsky has a day chart with Mars in the 7th house of relationships. So she has, again, the most difficult planet in the seventh house of relationships, and had like a major that become a major part of her life that's still like a dominant theme like years later, even though technically in terms of like the time frame of her life when she was involved with Bill Clinton was relatively small, but it's had repercussions or echoes for the rest of her life.
Mm-hmm.
Who else? There's a lot of, I don't want to bum people out with like negative examples or too many negative examples. We had one positive, like counteracting one I thought was interesting, which was the chart of Bill Gates. So he has Cancer rising and Capricorn on the seventh house, and Saturn is ruling the seventh house, and it's at 21 Scorpio in the fifth house in a night chart. So the ruler of the seventh house is actually technically the more difficult planet, or the most difficult planet in his chart. However, he's got some major mitigations going on. One of them is that Saturn is closely conjunct Venus, which is the most positive planet in his night chart, and Venus is helping to counterbalance Saturn a little bit by bringing the sort of positive energy to that placement by a close conjunction within a degree or so. But also there's a square coming in from the other side from Jupiter, which is at 27 degrees of Leo, squaring Saturn from a superior position earlier in the order of signs, so that the other benefic planet is also trying to balance Saturn out at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So for him, of course, he got married to Melinda Gates, and they formed the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and have had a relatively happy but also very like productive and successful marriage, where he transitioned away from being the CEO of Microsoft to heading up this major nonprofit organization with his wife, and they have this sort of not just romantic relationship, but also a serious partnership and like business relationship with each other at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good example of the mitigations and also Saturn being used productively. I'm trying to remember if their foundation focuses on children at all. Do you know if it does?
Yeah, especially vaccinations is one of their big things.
Oh, okay. So children, because I was thinking about the ruler being in the fifth, and sometimes every now and then I've seen like a placement that looks challenging, like this one, like the Saturn, even though with the two mitigations, but I've seen it sometimes describing something about what they're doing with it. Mm-hmm. And that could be something like they're trying to help children who are in a bad place.
Yeah. So always pay attention to mitigations, because even sometimes more difficult placements can be significantly offset and not be a huge issue if there's major offsetting factors present.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, never mind.
Which one do you want to go for?
We could do Amanda Knox.
Okay.
Amanda Knox has Saturn in the seventh house, and it's ruling the ninth and the eighth. And of course, I'm sure she'll go on to have, a much longer life and other relationships. But one of the things she was known for already was when she was going through that trial in Italy as she was a foreign exchange student, and there was like a murder trial, if you know who this is, where they were accusing her and her boyfriend at the time, her Italian boyfriend, of murder. And so it was just in the news a lot, and she kept being connected to like this boyfriend. And so even though I'm sure that's not like her legacy forever, it was just kind of a prominent thing. And there was a question, I think, I'm forgetting the details of the case at this point, but there was a question of like whether he might have been lying or something like that. So anyway, Saturn ruling the ninth of foreign places and also the legal system. Yeah.
Yeah, and she was in a ninth house profection year. It was activating her ninth house when she went to Italy to study abroad for a year. And then her roommate was murdered, and her boyfriend were charged and imprisoned, and then later acquitted of the murders.
Right. So you get the topics of the legal system, of foreign places, foreign countries, as well as mortality with the eighth house.
And then
I'd like to try Harry and his brother, because there's a discussion about conflict between the two of them.
William?
Right.
In terms of relationships?
Synastry and evaluation.
Yeah. I mean, I had William's chart, but the only reason I had it up was partially because he has a relatively well-placed ruler of the 7th in terms of zodiacal dignity and not being terribly afflicted. And I thought that was a good example just in terms of if the ruler of the 7th house is relatively well situated in the chart, it can indicate that that area of the life will go relatively smoothly or will be relatively lucky or successful. So he has Gemini on the cusp of the 7th house, and the ruler is Mercury, which is in Gemini in the 7th house, not making a hard aspect with Mars or Saturn.
And it's interesting that both of them also have Venus in really good dignity. They both have Venus in rulership. So Venus in Taurus here for Prince William and Venus in Libra for Prince Harry.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. And then I don't want to, there's so much speculation surrounding his relationship with his brother and everything that I want to get into that too much. But that's certainly another aspect of synastry, which is not just romantic relationships, but how you relate to different people around you, which can include parents, siblings, coworkers, friends, and even enemies or people that you don't get along with.
Mm-hmm. I noticed when I pulled up the Macrons charts that they had really strong synastry in terms of Emmanuel Macron's ascendant ruler is Saturn. Where did it go? Saturn in early Virgo. And then she has early Virgo rising. And Saturn conjunct an angle of someone else's chart can sometimes mean like a long-lasting bond.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it was kind of notable because her time was otherwise sounding kind of rounded, even though it was supposedly from the birth certificate, but was like 3 p.m. even. So I was always a little concerned about that being definitely the exact time. But when I saw her ascendant being at early Virgo rising and his ascendant ruler is early Virgo rising, I was like, oh, okay.
All right. Does anybody else have any good examples from your personal life, like past examples that you feel like sharing? Do you want to do it? Yeah. Okay. What's your first name?
Rhiannon, Rhiannon.
What's your birth date?
December 2nd, 1987.
What time?
6:39 p.m. Topeka, Kansas. Topeka, yeah.
All right. And is your sun at 5 Cancer?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I have that fun Venus Neptune conjunction. So
Venus is at so your descendant is at 5 Capricorn, Venus is at 6 Capricorn, and it's conjunct closely Neptune at 6 Capricorn as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the illusion and disillusionment rings true. Things starting out as like fairy tale, and then having a sudden moment of what is actually going on here. I think like I have a lot of love stories, but the biggest one would be the one in my Saturn return, since the ruler of my Venus is Saturn. I lived off the grid with my Capricorn boyfriend, and it was an abusive relationship that ultimately, the kind of interesting factor is the 6th house can be pets. Mm-hmm. So we got 2 dogs together. And that still connects us to this day. But what ended up happening is I ended up in the hospital almost dying, but I didn't. And I'm still connected to that person through the co-parenting, which I kind of attribute to the fact that I have that Venus-Neptune forgiveness. So even though there was like an intense situation, I still can kind of manage with boundaries a relationship, not a romantic relationship, but one in which I can still have contact with the dogs, which he has.
Okay.
So
that's great. Mm-hmm. Yeah. With the ruler of the 7th house of relationships and the 6th house. And one of the classical indications of the 6th is pets, which oftentimes when people read it, sometimes sounds like a blow off signification of like, why do we need to know about this in the chart? But in reality, pets can oftentimes play a major role in like a person's life.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds silly, but if you like the fact that my Venus and Saturn are connected, I love my dogs. Right. So it's enough of a motivator to stay connected. And then the 6th house being health, just thinking about the hospital, Saturn with the isolation and like actually being in the mountains off the grid kind of brings in those Saturnian themes. So
definitely.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the Venus-Neptune conjunction, you said that's been like a recurring theme or something you've experienced at other times. Like how like we tried our best to describe that, but how would you describe that like sequence in terms of, did you feel like we did a good job of adequately describing that, or is there any aspect of it that's been unique?
So for instance, dating artists, dating children of like famous artists, that kind of thing, sort of fairy tale scenarios that like, it's, it starts off in a way that sounds like it should be in a movie. So like the Neptune kind of thing. But they're always being like, you're talking about a friend. It's like, I just met someone at the train station and this is the person. That is definitely true of like, it really seems like that in the beginning, but then there might be like a substance abuse issue with Neptune. So that kind of comes out over time, and then the rose-colored glasses are off. So.
Okay.
Yep.
Perfect. Yep. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate
Thank you for the example. Yeah.
Cool. All right. So I think we're getting towards the end of this. Does anybody else have like one last really good example? No? Okay. That's all right. So
What's a bad example?
I mean, I have my like classical ones like
you have Eva Braun in there.
I have like, well, we have birth times for both Hitler and Eva Braun, and even though it's kind of cliche to use Hitler as an example because astrologers use it way too much historically, if you were to look at his chart, he has Aries on the 7th house, and the ruler is Mars, which is in the 8th house of mortality, and it's in a day chart, so Mars is the most challenging planet in his chart, and of course one of his earlier lovers was like a niece who ended up committing suicide, potentially in order to escape from him. And then he famously got married. And then subsequently his honeymoon was him and his wife committed suicide together in a bunker as World War II was coming to an end. So not the most pleasant example, but descriptive or evocative of, extreme version of that placement, let's say worst case scenario. Weirdly, we have her chart, and she actually has a night chart. So the sun is down in the 4th house, and she was born just after midnight with Scorpio rising, and Saturn is placed in the 7th house of relationships. So she got married to Hitler with Saturn as the most difficult planet in the chart in the 7th house of relationships, and I think we could accurately say that was probably one of the more difficult areas for her life. Although it's interesting because she has the ruler of the 7th house is Venus, which is the most positive planet in her chart in Capricorn, applying to a trine with that Saturn and attempting to offset it to make it more positive. But ultimately, questionable whether Venus was successful or not.
Right. Yeah, that's a good description of, objective look at the relationship versus like subjective. So maybe her subjective experience was like offset by that Venus ruling and applying by trine, and then the objective would be like literally married to Hitler, Saturn in a night chart in the 7th.
Well, and also that she did get married at some point. So
yes,
it's like somebody could say
it is saying yes to a marriage. That's true.
Technically, she did get married,
right?
But it was just married to Hitler.
Yes.
Okay. So those are our like bad examples. There's other similar one is like Aretha Franklin. Because hers is interesting because it's a similar situation where she has a night chart with Saturn in the 7th house of relationships. And so some of the most difficult things in her life came in the sphere of relationships, or it was an area that she struggled with throughout her life. But then Venus is the ruler of the 7th house, and it's actually placed in Aquarius at 20 degrees of Aquarius in the 4th house, applying to a square with Saturn, and they're actually exchanging signs in a mutual reception. So there's this interesting mitigation going on where Venus is trying to offset Saturn and is having some success because she was actually married eventually, I think a few different times in her life, but the 2 of the marriages broke up. One of the marriages was abusive. One of the marriages she left due to her having to tend to like her sick father, and that causing like tensions in the marriage that eventually caused it to fall apart. And then finally, her third marriage, she was together with this guy towards the end of her life for a very long time, but they never officially got married. And they almost came to doing it at one point several years before she died, but they didn't. But they still stayed together as a romantic partnership that was relatively successful. But it was almost like her final way of getting around that issue she had always run into was by not making it official and just having it as this relationship that was a positive force in her life, but just not officially tying the knot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so hers has an interesting interplay of several different factors that we've been discussing.
Yeah, because one of the questions that sometimes comes up is, will the native ever be married, or will the native have any relationships ever in their life? Because there's extreme scenarios where you have to realize that there's some people that either, let's say, not just never get married, but let's say never have a single significant romantic relationship in their entire life as the most extreme scenario. So one of the questions that sometimes you have to ask is, will this person have relationships? Or will this person be successful in relationships or have successful long-term relationships? And sometimes that's where the mitigating conditions can make a big difference.
For sure. And, it's a really good example where a lot of people, like clients, will come, and sometimes if they're really successful in other areas of their life, they think, why, what's wrong with me? I'm not having relationships. But you can really see clearly, I think, in a lot of these examples, the seventh house is a distinct area. It's not about you unless your ascendant ruler is there, and so sometimes it can be typified really differently than other areas of your life or even your life overall. And it really does come down to, what are the placements related to your seventh house or your natal Venus? What is the timing going on overall in your life as to whether relationships do happen or not, or whether you're happy with them or not?
Yeah. And depending on the timing, that's another thing, is relationships might not be a major factor in your chart, or may not be a hugely prominent factor, but at different points in your life, when major transits start going through the relationship sectors of your chart, or you have other significant activations, that may still bring significant relationships into your life during those times. And that's sort of important to note as well.
Yeah, definitely. So we're mostly focusing on the placements related to in the natal chart related to relationships today, but there's a huge interplay with the timing as to what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Does anybody have any questions before we wrap up here in the next 5 minutes? General questions about relationship astrology? Yeah. Yeah, to some extent, in terms of like fixed signs tending to start very slowly, but eventually once they get going, it can tend to be more fixed or more long lasting, as well as a propensity to want to stick with the same thing for longer and like not getting bored. Cardinal signs being good at like initiating things, but not having as much staying power necessarily, or mutable signs being sort of a mix of the two and a little bit in between.
I'd meant to bring that up with Elizabeth Taylor's, because she not only had that already extreme Venus-Uranus conjunction, and then in Aries, which can be a little impulsive, but her angles are mutable: Sagittarius ascendant, Gemini descendant. So the Gemini descendant could lend itself towards more, going back and forth or having multiples of relationships.
Right. Yeah.
What if you're a ruler of the seventh is in the first and you have no planets in the seventh?
It sometimes comes up with similar to the ruler of the ascendant in the seventh, in that there can be the relationships in the native's life can have a much greater role in shaping their sense of self than other people. That sometimes like the native sense of self and who they are and what they're about really becomes informed by their relationships. And sometimes that can be a good thing and a stabilizing thing. And other times it can mean that the personality gets submerged into relationships in a way that's not healthy if they completely give over their sense of self to their partner. But it just depends on how it's situated.
For sure. I would say pretty similar things, with just the small addition that for some people, the seventh house isn't only personal relationships, but can also be, if their work has to do with lots of one-on-one interaction, then sometimes the ruler of the 7th and the 1st, or the ruler of the 1st and the 7th, can indicate that there's some focus in your life on like lots of repeated one-on-one interactions or client work or something.
All right. So the last thing is just, even though a lot of these indications are very stark in retrospect, I think there's still a level potentially of negotiability if you know about what your placements are and what your predispositions or what your propensities are, to see if you can navigate those in constructive ways. And so that's always going to be one of the greatest challenges for everybody, is once you know what your tendencies are, what the possibilities are, how much can you try to either lean into that, or how much can you try to mitigate that and do what you can to deal with those scenarios constructively. So that goes for both the negative placements or the challenging ones, as well as the positive ones, in terms of learning how to use the positive things that were given in a way that's constructive or to their fullest extent. But I don't want anybody to walk away from this thinking that just because you have such and such placement that you're doomed to some specific scenario or some specific outcome. But instead, for a lot of these scenarios, there was a sense of like co-creation between meeting somebody in some objective circumstances happening in the life, but also sometimes certain things arising out of desires or wants or choices that were made on the part of the native. And that's a really important element that always has to be taken into account in relationships, is what choices are you making and what are you contributing to the relationship, and what choices can you make in the future in order to alter the outcomes if you want them to be different than they were in the past. Because the older each of us is and the longer we've lived, the more experience we've built up, so that we have a greater sense of freedom to make choices as time goes on. And that's what this is about, is just making those choices as consciously as we can.
For sure. Yeah, and just also remembering that these are not static placements, even though they kind of look like static placements when you're just looking at a birth chart. And so you might think, oh, this placement is forever how my 7th house plays out. But I think you've seen with some of these examples here, even some of the notable relationships that people are known for having weren't necessarily like the only relationship they had. Particularly, I'm thinking of if that was like a challenging piece of their life. Sometimes they went on and had other relationships that we're just not talking about now because it wasn't in the news or something. So always remember that as well.
Definitely. All right. Well, I think that's it then for this meeting and talking about relationship astrology. I hope everybody learned something or one or two useful things. And at some point, maybe we'll reconvene and do more chart sessions, because one of the things that was cool is hearing Joseph's story, because we talked to you like a year ago when we did the Profections example, and you're just going into that year. So it was interesting then to hear your retrospective analysis of what happened after the fact. And that's something that we're very much interested in with this group, is these types of work sessions where we keep learning and growing as astrologers and as a community by sort of pooling our efforts and pooling our research, and sharing those stories, just so we can improve as practitioners and as people that do astrology. So let's all plan to meet up again at some point in the future and maybe do another one of these meetings where we share charts and share experiences, just for the sake of learning and growing as a group. So thanks everybody for coming today and for joining us in this process and for this meeting. And hopefully we'll see you again next month.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks to the patrons who helped to support the production of this episode of the Astrology Podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to patrons Christine Stone, Nate Craddock, and Maren Altman, as well as the AstroGold Astrology app available at astrogold.io, the Portland School of Astrology at portlandastrology.org, and the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs available at honeycomb.co. The production of this episode of the podcast is also supported by the International Society for Astrological Research, which is hosting a major astrology conference in Denver, Colorado, September 10th through the 14th, 2020. More information about that at isar2020.org. And finally, also SolarFire Astrology software, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 for a 15% discount on that software. For more information about how to become a patron of the Astrology Podcast and help support the production of future episodes, while getting access to subscriber benefits like early access to new episodes or other bonus content, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast.